Imagine you are a sailor. The year is 1752. You are somewhere in the North Atlantic, far from any coast, far from any port. The sea is calm, too calm. And then, without warning, the water around your ship begins to churn. Something is rising from below, something enormous, something that, according to the men who survived, was wider than the ship itself. Now here is the question that has haunted historians, naturalists, and oceanographers for centuries. What did those sailors actually see? Because here is what makes the Kraken unlike almost any other creature in mythology. It didn't stay a legend. The ocean eventually gave us an answer, and that answer was far stranger and far more terrifying than anyone had imagined. My name is Nathan Wild, and few things fascinate me more than the moment when ancient myth collides with modern science. Today, we're going beneath the surface, literally and figuratively, to trace one of the most extraordinary stories humanity has ever told about the sea. To understand the Kraken, you have to understand the world the Norse people lived in, not the romanticized version you see in films, the real one. Brutal winters, violent seas, coastlines swallowed by fog for months at a time. These were people who sailed not because it was adventurous, but because it was necessary. The ocean was their road, their pantry, their graveyard. And the ocean, as any sailor will tell you, has a way of humbling you. The earliest written reference to what we now call the Kraken appears in Old Norse texts, where it is described not as a monster in the way we might imagine, but simply as an extraordinarily large sea animal, something encountered, something real, something that defied explanation.
The Norse word itself, krake, means something twisted, something bent out of shape. Not evil, exactly, just wrong. Something that shouldn't exist in a world built to a human scale. What's remarkable is that the Norsemen were not prone to exaggeration for its own sake. Their mythology was practical, deeply tied to the rhythms of survival. When they described a creature so large that sailors mistook it back for an island and made camp there and lit fires, they weren't trying to tell a children's story. They were trying to warn each other. But warn each other about what exactly? The first person to treat the Kraken with anything resembling scientific seriousness was Erik Pontoppidan, the Bishop of Bergen, who in 1752 published his Natural History of Norway. And here is where things become genuinely extraordinary. Pontoppidan wasn't a fantasist. He was a man of the church and of the Enlightenment, someone deeply suspicious of superstition. And yet, after interviewing dozens of Norwegian fishermen, he came to a startling conclusion. The Kraken, he wrote, was almost certainly a real animal, an animal so massive that its body, when it surfaced, could be mistaken for a small island, an animal that, when it dove back beneath the waves, created a whirlpool powerful enough to drag a ship under. Now, I want to be careful here, because Pontoppidan was working with second- and third-hand accounts, filtered through generations of oral tradition. He was not a marine biologist. But what's fascinating is the detail he preserved, the tentacles, the enormous circular body, the way it surfaced slowly, as if it had all the time in the world. These are not the details of a hallucination. These are the details of something observed. So what was it? By the middle of the 19th century, the scientific community had largely dismissed the Kraken as folklore. Marine zoology was advancing rapidly, and no evidence of any animal remotely matching the descriptions had ever been formally documented. And then, in 1861, something happened that changed everything. The French naval vessel Electon encountered something in the Atlantic Ocean near the Canary Islands. Something enormous, something with tentacles, something that the crew managed to partially haul aboard before it disintegrated under its own weight. The sailors brought back a fragment, a piece of tentacle, thick as a man's thigh, with suckers the size of dinner plates. The scientific establishment was skeptical. A single specimen, badly damaged, recovered under chaotic circumstances. It wasn't enough, but it was a beginning. Because what the Electon's crew had encountered, without knowing it, was a creature that had been hiding in the deepest trenches of the ocean since before humans walked the earth. The giant squid, Architeuthis ducks. Now, If you've been following this channel for a while, you know that I always try to resist the temptation to collapse a myth into a single neat explanation. Reality is almost always more complicated than that, and the Kraken is a perfect example. Yes, the giant squid is real. We know that now, beyond any doubt. The first confirmed photographs of a living specimen in its natural habitat weren't taken until 2004, and the first video footage in its natural deep-sea environment came in 2012. Think about that. We had satellites in orbit, rovers on Mars, and we still hadn't seen a living giant squid in the deep ocean until 13 years ago. That is how little we know about what lives beneath us.
But here is where it gets genuinely fascinating, because the giant squid alone doesn't fully explain the Kraken legend. The creatures described by Norse sailors were often depicted as island-sized, as creatures that moved slowly across the surface, as something almost geological in its presence. Giant squid, as extraordinary as they are, don't behave that way. They're predators, fast and violent, not slow island mimics. Which raises a question that marine biologists have been quietly debating for decades. What else might be down there? If you want to understand why the Kraken legend spread so far and so fast, reaching not just Scandinavia, but the coasts of Iceland, Scotland, the Faroe Islands, even the waters of the Mediterranean, you have to think about what the ocean looked like to a pre-scientific civilization. The sea was not a known quantity. It was not charted, not understood, not tamed. It was a place where ships simply vanished, and the people left behind needed an explanation. A story that said, the ocean has rules, and if you break them, something ancient and enormous will reach up and pull you down. Anthropologists who study maritime folklore point out something striking. Almost every seafaring culture in history has some version of the Kraken. The coastal peoples of West Africa described a vast sea creature called the Luquata. Ancient Greek sailors spoke of Scylla and Charybdis, the latter now widely believed to refer to a whirlpool, but whose origin may lie in encounters with large cephalopods near the straits. In Japan, the Akarokamui, a gigantic octopus-like creature said to inhabit the waters of Hokkaido, appears in Ainu mythology with a persistence that suggests it wasn't invented out of nothing. Personally, I find this one of the most fascinating aspects of the entire legend. Not that one culture imagined a sea monster, but that cultures separated by thousands of kilometers, with no contact, no shared language, no shared mythology, all looked at the ocean and imagined the same creature. What does that tell us about what they were seeing? If you're finding this investigation as fascinating as I am, consider joining me on the next one. I explore these stories every week, following the evidence wherever it leads, whether that takes us to ancient manuscripts, the labs of marine biologists, or the bottom of the ocean. Subscribe and don't miss what's coming next. Back to the question of what sailors might actually have been observing. The giant squid is the obvious answer, and a compelling one. Adult specimens can reach lengths of 13 meters, over 40 feet, with eyes the size of dinner plates, the largest eyes of any living animal on Earth. When a giant squid surfaces, which they do occasionally when injured or dying, they are a genuinely shocking sight. Writhing, pale, translucent, enormous. Something no sailor in the pre-scientific age would have any framework to understand. But marine biologists have proposed other candidates as well, and some of them are even more unsettling. The colossal squid, Mesonociotis hamiltoni, is different from the giant squid in ways that matter. It doesn't just rival the giant squid in length, it surpasses it in sheer mass. A fully grown colossal squid may weigh over 500 kilograms. Its tentacles are equipped not just with suckers, but with rotating hooks, actual hooks, like something from a nightmare, designed to grip and tear.
We know the colossal squid exists because we've found them in the stomach contents of sperm whales. We have almost never seen one intact. Then there is a third possibility, one that's more speculative, but that I find genuinely intriguing. Some researchers have suggested that certain Kraken sightings may have involved whale sharks, or large concentrations of fish so dense they appeared to form a solid mass at the surface. Others point to bioluminescent events, massive deep-sea organisms rising to the surface in conditions of unusual upwelling, creating glowing, shifting shapes in the water that ancient sailors would have had no way to interpret rationally. The ocean is not finished surprising us, not even close. There is one aspect of the Kraken legend that I find particularly haunting, and that most modern retellings ignore completely. In the original Norse accounts, the Kraken was not simply a monster, it was a sign, a portent. When the Kraken surfaced, it was believed to bring vast quantities of fish to the surface with it, driven up by the creature's enormous body displacing water as it rose. Fishermen would sometimes deliberately seek signs of the Kraken, not to avoid it, but to follow it, because where the Kraken went, the fish followed. This tells us something profound about how the Norse perceived this creature. It wasn't purely malevolent, it was part of the ecosystem, something ancient, something larger than human concerns, something that operated by its own rules. You didn't fight the Kraken, you respected it, you read it the way you read the weather. That relationship, that complicated, pragmatic respect for something vast and unknowable, feels very different from the way we tend to tell the story today.
Modern culture tends to make monsters purely threatening. The Norse understood that the ocean didn't work that way. The Kraken entered the literary mainstream in 1830 when Alfred Lord Tennyson published a short poem simply titled The Kraken, describing an ancient creature lying motionless at the bottom of the sea, sleeping through the ages, waiting for some final awakening at the end of the world. It's a strange, beautiful poem, and it captured something that pure natural history never quite manages, the sense that the Kraken belongs not just to biology, but to time itself, that it is a relic, a survivor from an era before humans, before civilization, before recorded history. Herman Melville's Moby Dick, published in 1851, contains one of the most chilling descriptions of a possible squid encounter in all of literature, a vast, pale, formless mass spotted floating at the surface, which the sailors regard with a horror they can barely articulate. Melville called it the Great Squid. He described it as the largest of living creatures, and he placed that encounter not at the climax of the story, but near the beginning, a warning sign, a bad omen, a thing glimpsed and then gone. He was writing fiction, but he was also, we now know, describing something that exists. In 1978, a Canadian fisherman named Harry Lane pulled up something extraordinary in the waters off Newfoundland. A fragment, a tentacle, massive, cold, smelling of the deep sea. When marine biologists examined it, they confirmed it came from a giant squid larger than any previously recorded specimen. Estimated length between 15 and 18 meters. The largest confirmed giant squid ever measured was just under 13 meters. 15 to 18 meters would be something else entirely. Something that begins to strain even the most rational mind. Now, I want to be absolutely clear. This specimen was never fully recovered. The measurement was an estimate. Science requires caution, and I respect that. But I also think it's worth sitting with the implication. If giant squid can reach sizes we haven't fully documented, in an ocean we've barely explored, then the question of where the Kraken legend ends and biological reality begins becomes considerably more complicated. We have mapped less than 20% of the ocean floor. We discover new deep-sea species every year. The largest biome on Earth remains, in the most literal sense, the unknown. The legend survived. Not for a decade, not for a century, for over 1,000 years, across multiple languages, multiple cultures, multiple scientific revolutions, the story of an enormous sea creature persisted. It persisted when the church tried to rationalize it away. It persisted when the Enlightenment tried to classify it out of existence. It persisted when 19th century science dismissed it as primitive superstition. And then the ocean sent us a photograph, and the photograph looked remarkably like the legend. That is not nothing. That is in fact one of the most extraordinary vindications in the history of natural history. A creature described in Norse sagas, dismissed for centuries as mythology, confirmed by a camera in the deep Pacific in 2004. They were describing something real. They didn't have the vocabulary or the science or the instruments to prove it, but they knew what they had seen. And the ocean, patient as always, eventually agreed. So where does that leave us? What is the Kraken?
It is, Almost certainly the giant squid, and possibly the colossal squid, seen through the terrified eyes of sailors who had no framework for understanding what a 12-meter cephalopod could be. It is a creature whose existence was proven not by mythbusters, but by the ocean itself on its own timeline. But it is also something more than that. It is a story that tells us how human beings have always responded to the unknown. With fear, yes, but also with imagination, with narrative, with the very human need to give a name and a shape to the darkness beneath the surface. Every culture that has ever lived near the sea has looked at the water and understood, instinctively, that something vast lives below. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, actually. The ocean is deeper than our reckoning, older than our stories, and it holds things we haven't named yet. The Kraken is real. Not exactly as the legends describe it, but real enough. Real enough that for 1,000 years, people who had actually been to sea kept insisting it was there. It looked back. If the Kraken has sparked your curiosity about what lies beneath the myths of ancient seafaring cultures, then the next investigation I think you'll find extraordinary is the story of the Leviathan, the biblical sea monster that appears in the Book of Job, in ancient Mesopotamian texts, in the earliest records of civilizations that had never even seen the ocean, a creature so vast it makes the Kraken look almost reasonable. The question of what inspired that legend goes somewhere darker and stranger than you might expect. I'll see you there.